You're listening to Shoe In, covering the ins and outs of all things footwear, from sneakers to heels, loafers to slippers, and every type of shoe in between. Brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. And now your footwear insiders, Matt Priest and Andy Holt.
Hello, footwear insiders around the globe in 65 plus different countries. My name is Matt Priest. I am joined by one Andy Holt.
That's me.
And we are here because sourcing is such a huge issue for our industry. We talk about it a lot. It's one of our wheelhouses.
Yeah, there's no shoes without sourcing.
There's no shoes without sourcing. They don't just, a magical shoe fairy doesn't show up and bring you your shoes. That's not how it works.
That's a fairy tale.
Total fairy tale.
The shoemaker and the elves.
Bring is right. And so what happens is a team of experts spanning the globe works tirelessly to design, develop, manufacture, sample, manufacture, ship, market, and sell shoes to you, the shoe consumer. And what better person to kind of give us insights on how that works is one Mike Jeppesen, who's president of global operations at Wolverine Worldwide. I
think Mike pretty much knows everything about sourcing.
Totally.
Mike has forgotten more than we'll ever know.
He is
100%.
I think he's the industry's resident expert. He has worked at Echo, Adidas, Coach, Saucony, Payless.
Yeah, but he ran a factory.
Run factories in Jakarta and Portugal and
And here's one of the defining things when you look at somebody in his position.
Yep.
All his teams love him.
Yep.
Because he outlines exactly what he wants and expects execution, and they know what to expect. They execute against that. But some of the best stories are from people who worked with him in the past and how Mike is so meticulously getting down to every single penny of cost in the sourcing and supply chain process, which is a lost art because a lot of brands use sourcing agents.
Yep.
So when Mike talks, we should listen.
We should. And he runs sourcing for 12 different brands. One of the cool things, Andy, is I got to do is Wolverine has their own podcast that's publicly available, and they asked me to come on and interview Mike for their podcast. And so I said, I'll do it under one condition. We can use it for ours as well.
That's right. Cross-pollinate.
Mike is my boss, so I said, whatever you want.
Please.
So with that, we're going to let you listen in on a conversation I had with Mike Jeppesen on the Wolverine Shoe Biz podcast. And so take a listen.
Podcast number 14. In this podcast, I'm proud to welcome two very distinguished guests. Our own resident expert on all things sourcing, Mike Jeppesen, president of the Global Operations Group. We'll discuss the current climate of tariffs and our global sourcing strategy with Matt Priest, president and CEO of the Footwear Distributors and Retailers of America. Matt also hosts the podcast Shoe In and has over 200 episodes to his credit. You can find Matt and the Shoe In cast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or from your browser at shoeinshow.com. And now, here's Mike and Matt.
So, Mike, I'm really excited about this conversation because you and I have worked together, goodness gracious, for probably a decade at this point, and I've had the opportunity to kind of learn under your expertise about global sourcing and footwear management and all the things that go into bringing in 2.5 billion pairs of shoes every year, which is what our industry does here in the U.S. And as a part of that, I wanted to kind of get to know you more as it relates to your role at Wolverine Worldwide. So why don't you kind of go through, from your perspective, what's your day-to-day role at the company, and how can people best understand what you do for Wolverine?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks again, Matt, for taking the call here. I'm the president of global operation for Wolverine Worldwide, and I'm running what we call the operations platform, which is a lot broader in scope than probably most companies in our industry have their operations. So we cover all the basics like sourcing and product development in Asia. We do logistics, inbound, outbound, transportation, and our distribution centers. But we also do things like IT. So, all the information technology that we do as a corporation resides within the GOG platform. We do customer service down in Richmond, and we do dealer services, but we also do internal sales. So we have a growing contingency of associates whose job it is to call on retailers in the field by phone and see we can move some product into their businesses. Obviously, we also have facility management. So we are managing about 43 sites on a worldwide basis, Rockford being the largest we have with about 300 acres and 1,100 associates. But we do all the support functions for the associates we have here on the various campuses. As we like to say, we mow the lawn, we move the snow, and we feed the people.
That's a lot of responsibility, mowing lawns and plowing snow and feeding people. But I think from my perspective, Mike, particularly in the environment we find ourselves as it relates to trade, you bring in a lot of product, you source a lot of product. So let's kind of go through the company's current sourcing profile, because there's been a lot of talk in the media about where U.S. companies are sourcing their footwear from, and what do those countries look like? And should the U.S. government add more tariffs on top of footwear, which of course we emphatically say no. But what countries are you sourcing from, and what has been the company's sourcing trend lines over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you go back to the mid-'80s or the late '80s when I started in this industry here, most of the shoes was either made in the U.S. or made in Europe. Very little was done in Asia at the time. There was some local production in various countries in Asia, but the majority of our production really came from the southern part of Europe and specifically the New England part of the United States. Over the years, we've seen a very fast migration. So we started in the late '80s, beginning of the '90s, by moving to places like Korea, later on to Taiwan, then Thailand, Indonesia, and then when China opened up in the early '90s, there was a mass influx of industries into China at the time, including footwear. Now, in the footwear industry in China, it was unique in the sense that we've been chasing cheap labor from all these different countries over probably a decade or two. But in China, it was the first time the industry kind of made a stand and say, this country is large enough for us. We're going to have a sourcing base here for the foreseeable future. And we're moving not only our factories here, we're also moving our raw material suppliers. So up until then, all the componentries we are using for shoemaking still resided in the US and in Europe. And was only in China being moved into, the southern part of the country as a result of a consolidation of the industry into China. At its heydays, China was accounting for north of 85% of the industry's imports into the U.S., as an example. So that's kind of the history lesson behind it. We discovered about 6 years ago that China was not sustainable. At the time, Wolverine Worldwide had just gone through an acquisition of PLG in Boston. So we now had a production that was around 80 million pairs on a yearly basis that we controlled, and another 20 million that came through licensing and agents. But we were 78% China-based at that point in time. And Scott Thomas, who was the sourcing lead in China at the time, and I sat down and says, this is not sustainable. We can't have all our egg in one basket. We need to find a way to diversify out of China. And we started that migration basically back in 2014. So we have taken the number from China down from 78%, and this year here we will be less than 22% China-based. So we've seen a significant migration out of China. So the big question is, where do these pairs go? Well, the mother load of it went to Vietnam. So Vietnam is the single largest benefactor of the move out of China. But we also opened up countries like Bangladesh. We moved back into Indonesia in a larger scale. We opened up Cambodia, and we have now significantly increased our production in India. Today, Vietnam is nearly 50% of our total sourcing volume, and that's not a comfortable place to sit either. So over the next couple of years, we're going to see a migration coming out of Vietnam as prices and cost increases in that country as well.
So it's interesting, Mike, that 22% for China product is a low percentage for a company like Wolverine. And what I mean by that, that's a number you'll hear out of an athletic brand, like a fully athletic brand, Nike, Adidas, and others. That's not a number that you hear out of a company that has a lot of brown shoe production, that has a lot of work boot production, some outdoor products, some casual and lifestyle product. And so it seems to me you guys were on the cutting edge of trying to diversify even before any of the kind of the trade considerations took effect.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could take credit for the fact that I knew that Trump would be the president and start imposing trade on us in 2018. But that's not the case. I mean, we moved out of China for different reasons. We moved out of China because of the one-child policy that really made it scarce to get workers in the factories. We moved out of China because of increased cost. And we moved out of China because legislation in the country made it harder and harder for our businesses to operate in that country. But you're right. I mean, we are sitting pretty good right now compared to the industry. And since you're running one of the largest institutions in the industry today, you can remind me what the average import was in 2019 from Asia.
Yeah, I mean, it's 70% is kind of what we are relying on, 68, 69%. So you guys are well below kind of the current rate at which we're sourcing from China. So that's kudos to you. But I think at the end of the day, when you look to source from a new country, so you're making all these moves and you're coming up with a strategic plan to move around, what are some of the variables that you weigh and you analyze? Is it a technical analysis? Is it gut? How do you kind of make the decisions to move to certain countries and then stay away from other countries?
Well, it really starts at the highest level. When we consider a new country, we look at, is there a rule of law? Is there a way for you to get arbitration by the court system? Is there a law around minimum wages, labor relations that you have to follow? So those are very important things for us. Also, is there an available labor force presence in the country? Is there a certain level of youth workers that is typically what we see in the shoe factory? So, young people from the age of, say, 18 to 30 years old is kind of the predominant age group we have in shoe factories. And then also, is there a stable political, system in the country that we are considering? We don't want to be in the middle of a revolution or in the middle of a hostile takeover of government. So we got to make sure that we're not moving our factory partners into countries where we can't sustain the production. And then we look at the economical system. Is there a reasonable stability on currency? Is there rapid deflation of the currency or inflation of the currency? Is there something happening with the barrier to entry in terms of getting the raw materials into that country? Do we have to consider a movement of foreign currency in and out? So there's all those considerations that we have to take the boxes on first. Once we've done that, we will typically have a dialogue with some of our core factory partners. So 80% of what we produce today is done by 19 factory groups. Those represent by far the majority of what we do as a corporation. And we'll sit down with them and we'll talk to them about, if they have an interest in investing in any of these countries that we have on the horizon. We don't do it ourselves. We don't own any, manufacturing facilities. We don't want to be promiscuous and go out and find new partners every time we move to another country. So we typically are holding on to the tail of the 19 Taiwanese tigers we work with here and having them kind of move us from one country to the other at our discretion and our choice.
That makes a lot of sense. So one of the things I want to do, and I love this exercise, and you and I have done it before, but let's do a word association exercise. So I'm going to say a country name, and you just kind of give the first word or two that comes to mind as it relates to sourcing in that country. So it'll give our listeners an idea of how do we kind of break it down, just a couple phrases as we think about these different countries. So, for example, Vietnam.
Maxed out. Vietnam is the country that is taking over the bulk of production coming out of China today. Unfortunately, there's such a run on that country now from all the latecomers to the game. So as we are sitting now at 22% China, other companies in our industry is sitting at 70, 80, 90+% China-based, and they're desperate to move out of there right now. The only short-term solution they have in Vietnam, and that is putting a lot of pressure on pricing and capacity.
Okay, next up, Indonesia.
Big opportunity. Indonesia is probably one of the countries that has the most stable government, believe it or not, stable economical situation, clear rule of law, very investor-friendly, with a large population of 200 million plus people. They're pretty much scattered around the country, so it's not a concentration like you see in some countries where everybody sits in the same city. So it's a very attractive sourcing country for us going forward.
Okay. Bangladesh.
Bangladesh has been a big surprise to us in a positive sense. When James Ho came to us 5-6 years ago and said he wanted to open up facilities in Bangladesh, we all had to bring a map out to find out where the heck that was. But he's done a fantastic job setting it up, and knock on wood, we've had a very good ride with James Ho and Golden Chang in Bangladesh over the last 6+ years. We continue to invest in Bangladesh. We're opening it up to other factory groups now. We're working with Stella there. We're working with Pao Chan. We're looking into young ones and others. So we're seeing Bangladesh as a growth area for us as we go forward.
What about Cambodia?
Cambodia to us is basically an extension of Vietnam. They're landlocked with Vietnam. It's a small country, relatively meager infrastructure, but they're very close to their borders with Vietnam. And you can actually move the product from Cambodia through the border to Ho Chi Minh City and ship it out from there. So it's an extension of Vietnam, I would say, at this point in time.
Okay, let me do just a couple more, and these may be some curveballs, but the Philippines.
Well, the Philippines is a country that is coming back again. I mean, I remember back in the 80s, we were doing sourcing out of the Philippines. There was a lot of apparel and gloves and accessories and a little bit of footwear coming out there, too. Jack Chang, my good friend from Stella, is opening up. He's bought his second facility in Manila, and he's up and running now. We did some Sperry production with him last year and this year here. Been pretty happy about it. And, I'm bullish on Philippines. I think they're going to be a sourcing country of the future.
Let's make our way towards the west somewhat. We'll start in Africa. Ethiopia is the one country in Africa that seems to be taking advantage of duty-free access to the U.S. marketplace for footwear. How do you view Ethiopia?
Well, Scott Thomas and I always says that we leave that to the next generation. So I'd hand it over to Ron Bosnick. He's not been very receptive either. So with Onda Ors now coming on board with the sourcing organization in Hong Kong, we'll see whether the first to do it. I'm not a big fan of Ethiopia. I think we have betted on Bangladesh, and that's kind of our Africa, if you want. Mm-hmm. Companies like Caleres has a very large investment there. Tom's, Michael Kors, others have placed orders in Ethiopia with varying degrees of success. But it's not a place that I see growing for Wolverine in the next foreseeable future.
All right, and last but not least, the good old U.S. of A. How you feeling about U.S. sourcing?
Well, I'd love to make all our shoes in the U.S. I'd rather not be on a plane, 6 to 7 times to Asia, but it's not feasible. I mean, the cost structure we work under just doesn't allow it to work. We sold our last U.S. factory last year up in Big Rapids, and it was just in recognition of the fact that we couldn't make money on it. Even trying to sell to the government, we were not able to turn a profit on it. The difference is very simple. It takes about 1 hour to make a pair of shoes. So effective time where people are touching the product and moving it forward is about 60 minutes. But if you look at the cost structure in Asia, it varies somewhere between $3 to $4 an hour. And that goes into the costing side of it. The compatible cost here in the U.S. is around $11, $12 an hour in a shoe factory, plus 25 to 30% benefits, healthcare, pension, so on and so forth. So the cost in the U.S. is closer to $17 an hour compared to the $3, $4 you pay in Asia. So if you take that $13 difference and you look at the markup we have from landed cost to retail, it's about 4.5 times. So if you take the $17 times 4.5, now you're talking an $80 higher price for the labor content alone in a pair of shoes. So that's really what is reflected in the pricing. So you can sell a pair of shoes in the U.S. made in China for $100. If you want to have it made in the U.S., it's $180. The customer will tell you that they want made in USA, and they don't want to pay for it. That's the experience we have. So the extra cost of the product in the end is not meaningful to the consumer to an extent that they're prepared to pay nearly double the price for it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's often what we've thought as we think about, there's a lot of polling around sustainability. Who wants a sustainable pair of shoes? And everyone wants a sustainable pair of shoes until it costs double the price, or the colorway's not good, or the function and doesn't do what it needs to do. So polling is often a little skewed in this way. But let me get back to China. You talked about your history in China, which you went through so well. But let's get into the trade war. It was launched, I guess, in August of 2017. The administration decided it wanted to pursue China's unfair trade policies, many of which we kind of support in this area, whether it's forced technology transfers or it's intellectual property theft, and those types of activities that China has been focused on via its China Made in 2025 plan. So that's out there, but I think there's a lot of debate on should we do this, should we not, and obviously there are a lot of people who think we should tariff more product coming in. There's a lot of people who don't think we should. At the end of the day, uncertainty is the one thing we can all agree on that has kind of plagued the supply chain over the last few years. So what has the last 2 years of uncertainty taught you about our relationship as an industry with China, as a footwear industry? What has changed? Is there any going back to where we were before, or is that 22% for Wolverine Worldwide kind of the ceiling at this point?
Yeah, I mean, your first part of your question is what have we learned from the last 2 years? I would say that the strategy we put in place 6 years ago was based on the fact that we would only engage with factory partner who had multi-country sourcing and multi-branded capabilities. And that has really been our saving grace. So we are today nearly 100% working with large factory groups that are able to move production from one country to the other when something happens. And it's not just the trade. We have natural catastrophes happening. We had the tsunamis down in Indonesia a few years back. We had the riots in Vietnam 5 years back. We've had a number of different events that are forcing us to move our production around. And it's a lot easier to have a factory partner move it from one country to another country than going from one factory partner to another factory partner. So I would say that's one of the learnings we have. The other is the notion of multi-branded facilities. Our forecasting capabilities are relatively limited, and our hit rate is relatively low when we start predicting what our demand is. But having multiple brands in the same facility allows us to flex from one brand to the other if we run out of order or if the orders are coming in higher than we anticipated. So that allows us to kind of mesh that out. When it comes to the trade war specifically, I'm a student of history. I believe that if you understand history, you'll be able to predict the future to a large extent. And if you look back again to the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley Act, it was basically the start to a number of catastrophic events. So what happened in 1930 was the U.S. decided to be more insular. They wanted to protect themselves against the rest of the world after the First World War. And they started putting up trade barriers specifically on Europe. What happened was the European countries followed suit shortly after that. And all of a sudden you had this trade war taking place where nobody wanted to ship to each other's countries and nobody wants to import the other country's product. What happened was the world economy, the trade on a worldwide basis went down by 40% over a 5-year period of time. It started the big depression that happened at that point in time as well. And ultimately, I believe it led to the Second World War because of that isolationist policy that both the European and the American countries were taking.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the history is bound to repeat itself, and that's one of the concerns that we have about this isolationism that is arising in the form of trade barriers and tariffs and the like. And so my hope is that cooler heads prevail. But in the meantime, I mean, if you think about kind of the act, one of the things that's really kind of been fascinating to me is how much a tweet or one kind of pronouncement on public policy impacts not only just what our industry is doing to recalibrate itself from a sourcing perspective, but what the entire economies are doing as it relates to, tech, apparel, footwear, pharmaceuticals, crafts, books, publishing, and everyone is kind of going through this recalibration with China. What are some of the pitfalls moving your sourcing operation under this pressure? It's not like, it sounds like you guys didn't do it under this kind of pressure. You had a plan in place and you're executing against that plan. But if you're a company that's 100% China right now or 90% China, what are some of the pitfalls of having to do this under pressure? And are there any silver linings that go along with the kind of pressure that we're seeing come to bear under 301?
Yeah, I mean, that's the crush of the issue, right? I mean, we are living in a world right now where there's not much distance from a thought to a tweet. You and I lamented under the previous administration that the Obama administration was way too tight-lipped and closed up from a communication perspective, and Trump administration definitely has changed that, to an extent that there's just a barrage of information coming out that is very disjointed, and you don't really know which one to act on and which one to ignore. And that's really what we're facing as businesses today. When we're getting information from the president's cell phone before the USTR knows what the heck's going on, that's a problem. There's no filtering. It's just a barrage of information that is just being shared very, very broadly. And it's up to us to filter through it and decide what we act on and what we don't. So that's kind of my crush on that side. Is there a silver lining? Well, it's really hard to move production around and still meet the deadline and the pricing and the quality expectations. So when we are forced to move out of a country like China, it's not a trivial thing. As you said, we are in a much better situation than most companies are. But if you are some of the more fashion-driven companies in New York or Los Angeles that is heavily vested in China today, you're panicking because we're not just talking about paying small incremental fees. We're talking about paying 15% additional fees on top of the landed cost prices on every pair of shoes. And we're beginning to see brands announcing price increases in the marketplace in the U.S. today. So there's nothing good coming out of trade barriers in my mind. Is there a silver lining? Is it something that's helpful? Well, I mean, forcing us out of China because of the tariffs in the U.S. is actually helping us offset some of the tariff we are paying in Europe. So in the European Union, we typically pay about 10% on duty from China. And now as we're moving into other countries, they don't have as high a duty rate into Europe. So there's there's another consequence of these moves that is on the positive side, but it's not outweighing the cost it has for us to do all the moves that we otherwise are forced to do.
Right, which is just another illustration of how interconnected all of this is. I mean, we're at the threshold where just now they're announcing that there's going to be a regional trade agreement signed in 2020 with China and pretty much every Asia Pacific Rim country except the U.S. And it just shows you that while we are kind of erecting these barriers, the countries around us and our trading partners under things like the TransPacific Partnership are looking to continue the march towards trade liberalization. And so all these things kind of cobbled together makes it's just a sign that everything's interrelated. So the impact, wherever the president's squeezing the balloon on one end, is going to have a dramatic impact throughout our supply chain in areas we can't even contemplate right now. And the consumer here in the U.S. has no idea what's going on. And that's a challenge. If there was only a call out on the receipt, Mike, that said, tariff charge, shoe tax on it, then we might have a little bit more oomph behind a grassroots level campaign with our consumers to push back on that. But it's, that will come with inflation. And then I think at that point, I think the American people will have voted with their purchasing power. But that's just kind of where I view this. What does Wolverine sourcing look like 5 years from now? You've laid out kind of up to this point. Are you trying to develop even more agility in your supply chain, or are we just taking a breather right now as it relates to the structure you have? Are you always searching for the next way in which you will alter the footwear supply chain for Wolverine?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, again, I think we vacillate between playing offense and playing defense, right? So we had probably a good 3-4 years of playing offense, getting lead times down, getting quicker deliveries, narrowing the bell curve at getting more reliable, on-time deliveries. But I got to tell you, the last 12 months we've been playing defense. So we try to maintain while we are moving. So to illustrate it, we're going to move 20 million pairs out of China this year alone. So not a trivial amount of shoes when you think about it. And it's the threat of tariffs is equal to imposing tariffs. So it's all the noise level that we are reacting to in the marketplace that is kind of forcing us to make these moves. What will it look like in the future? I don't see us going back to China. I think China is going to be too expensive. China is going to focus more on internal consumption than export. They're going to find ways to make it more expensive to make shoes and export them out of China over the next period of time. I think the sourcing scene is going to be more dispersed than it is right now. More countries that we may even haven't thought about yet are going to pop up on the scene. But I think definitely there's a lot of stuff moving into Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand even. We are beginning to source out of Thailand again. Cambodia, Bangladesh, India. And then there's, the whole question about Africa. Again, I don't have a strong success expectations coming out of that, but eventually they're going to crack the code there too and be successful in doing so. We've been dabbling in Western Hemisphere for a while. We had, factories in the DR. We are now still sourcing a small proportion of our production in the DR. Mexico, every one of our 12 brands today having small production in Mexico. We are sourcing out of Guatemala. We looked at El Salvador, Honduras. We looked at Brazil. We looked at, a number of different South American and Central American countries. But nobody's really been able to set up the scale of production that we have in China. Unless you've been to see a Chinese facility, like a Baotian facility with 30,000 people, it's a city. It's not a small shoe factory. If you go in comparison to a place like Dominican Republic and Mexico, it's 2 or 3 lines with a couple of hundred people. So it's a very different scale. It's a very different cost structure, and it's a lot different in how you deal with those companies. So I think the short answer is the good old days was the early 2000s when we sourced 80% of our production out of China, and all the tanneries and sole making facilities were right there next door to the factories. Ever since then, it's going to be harder and harder. When we move into places like Cambodia and India, the lead time just from a raw materials shipping perspective and a shipping of the actual finished product is significantly longer than it is from China. The illustration I always use is if you take a picture of China and the west coast of California, and you imagine there's a pipeline, very fat pipeline going straight from southern China to California, that's kind of the most effective sourcing strategy you can have. That's really how we can optimize our lead time, our cost structure, and everything else. Every time you now put another diversion on that pipe into other countries, you are prolonging the lead time, you're prolonging the time it takes to make the product, and in certain cases, you're taking risk on cost and quality. So that's really where the diversification that we are seeing from a sourcing perspective is making that equation a lot more complicated to manage.
So that leads me to my kind of last topic area, if you will, as we round out this conversation. And it's actually in light of the announcement just yesterday that Adidas is closing down the Atlanta Speed Factory that had opened in 2017. I was going to talk to you about digitization and automation and how these are being developed to enhance our supply chains and production, mainly in Asia, but as Adidas was attempting to do here in the U.S. as well. I think this is being driven by a number of perfect storms. We've talked about some of them, obviously the political unrest and trade issues, but changing retail behavior, product innovations. From a 30,000-foot level, how should we think about these dramatic shifts? And ultimately, is agility really the name of the game when it comes to sourcing?
I got kind of a slightly different, more diversified perspective on that stuff. When Nike and Adidas and Under Armour launched into relationship with vendors that could make onshore production in Europe and in the US, there was a lot of excitement about it. I had the pleasure of touring the Under Armour facility with yourself a few years back, and I've seen some of the stuff that Adidas was doing in Europe, but it never struck me as being a viable solution. We had a proposal on the table here to spend $5.8 million in CapEx and $4.2 million in infrastructure costs to create a domestic facility in the U.S. that could make about 400,000 pairs of shoes. And that was all in reaction to the pressure we got from the corner office and the board to kind of step it up and follow suit with all these other companies investing heavily into technologies. But it was really ambivalent from my perspective. I had no interest in doing it, and I never thought it was the right thing. And once you confronted the brands and said, okay, Saucony, I need 200,000 pairs in order from you, and Merrill, I need 200,000 pairs in order from you. You're going to buy these shoes, you're going to sell them for $165 each, and you're going to go out and compete with the athletic guys. That was not a lot of takers, and thank God that we were able to kill that project because, as you mentioned, all of these companies have now scaled that back and closed it down at a significant expense. It's not cheap to build a shoe factory, and it's definitely not cheap to close it down and lay off people and do all the other stuff. I think technology plays a role in the product development cycle. I think definitely what we've seen with Merrill here is that we can halven the time in going to market by using computer technologies such as 2D printing, 3D printing, 3D rendering. All the stuff we're doing with PDM has shown us is possible to do so. But it takes discipline, it takes structure, it takes investment to get it up and running. But once you have it up and running, you can actually benefit from it greatly in terms of timelines. The thing that people always hone in on is manufacturing lead time and shipping lead time. What they often forget is it takes 425 days when we have a seasonal kickoff meeting until the consumer sees those shoes. Out of the 425, about 28 days is transportation, and about 100 days is manufacturing. The other 300 days is sitting in the prep work that we are doing in the brand in developing the styles, getting them to confirmation stage, then making salesman samples, going out and selling it in with the customers, and then commercializing it once we get the orders. Those three last events here are taking nearly 200 days by itself. And that's why we have possibilities. Instead of doing that sequential, if we can do it parallel and we can come up with styles that we have enough confidence in that we can go out and sell them in as we're developing and commercializing them, and as we're developing maybe virtual salesman samples, it can take a significant proportion of the 425 days out. We can halven it to 220 days or so, we believe. So that's why I see technology play a much bigger role than in manufacturing. Now, having said that, we still are focusing on taking time out of manufacturing through automizing our facilities. So we are working closely with these facilities in Asia to set up automatic stitching, automatic cutting, automatic sole laying, and any time we can take people off the line and replace them with a robot, we'll do so. Because robots can work 24/7 and they don't need to take lunch breaks. So we are much better off replacing every time we can with an automized production. It also is a lot better for quality because there's not the human element built into it. And that's why I really think those two parallel parts, so use all the sexy stuff in order to shorten down your lead time from a go-to-market perspective, and use investment in the facilities to take people off the line and reduce the number of hours associated with making the shoes.
Well, with that, Mike, as we close out this conversation, what kind of closing thoughts do you have? Anything on how the industry should be collectively approaching these challenges? What do Wolverine associates need to be aware of in order to be more plugged into kind of all these things that are going on, particularly in the sourcing and the trade world?
Well, I would say that most of our conversation here is centered around supply chain, right? So as we really focused on the sourcing side and delivery of the product, I think we can't forget the relationship we have with our wholesale customers, the retailers in the various countries we are selling. I think the short answer is there needs to be more connectivity between the supply side and the distribution. We got to find out how do we stay connected, how do we become more important to our retail partners, just as we need to be more important to our factory partners. We need to apply the same logic that we have done on the supply side and saying there's certain people we want to play with, there's certain people we don't want to play with. But how do we differentiate our product in the marketplace, and how do we sub-optimize our sourcing in order to be more narrow but deeper in how we go to market with these products and how we deliver the product in the end to the end consumer. But going back to the speed, agility, and the precision, that is the name of the game. So speed, agility, and precision, both from a supply chain and from a retail perspective, is really what the game is all about.
Well, with that, Mike, I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to kind of make my way into the Wolverine family here and have this conversation with you, so that more and more people within the Wolverine company can understand what you do on a daily basis. And this should not go without saying, but Mike is one of the preeminent experts on footwear sourcing, having served at so many different footwear companies and all around the world, in factories, out of factories, all over the place. And for FDRA, as our chairman currently, it could not be better positioned for us as we navigate through the uncertainty of the trade war. And so, Mike, thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation, and keep doing what you're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for taking your time.
So that was my conversation with Mike Jeppesen, who is an expert, to say the least, and just a true industry leader. Hope you learned a lot from it. For more episodes on Shoe and Show, go to shoeandshow.com. You can check us out on any of the platforms that have podcasts anywhere in the world. You can rate us 5 stars only, please. Please do that, though. It helps us kind of get our message out there. And now, you can go to our website, shoeandshow.com, and leave us a voice message. And if it's cool enough or interesting enough, we may play it on one of our episodes. So check that out. It's a new tool at your disposal. But we appreciate you listening in. Andy, thanks for joining in the conversation.
Absolutely.
And
I'm the bookend.
You are the bookend, my friend. And until next time, Shoe In is out.
Shoe In has been brought to you by the FDRA, the Footwear Industries Association focused on retail, trade, politics, and fashion, helping create and enhance conversations on all things footwear. For information about FDRA, visit fdra.org.